As I sat at the elegantly set Thanksgiving dinner table in my parents' house, surrounded by the comforting familiarity of my childhood home, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. At 60, these visits had become my refuge from the stifling atmosphere of my own home. The lively chatter of my daughter Emma with her grandmother filled the room, a stark contrast to the silence that often enveloped my conversations with Richard, my husband. My phone vibrated sharply, disrupting the warmth of the moment. Richard's name flashed across the screen, sending a shiver down my spine. With a hesitant sigh, I excused myself. "Excuse me, it's Richard. I'll just take this in the kitchen." But as I rose, my fingers slipped and the phone's speaker activated. "Elaine, having fun over there?" "Well, don't bother coming back." Richard's voice, unnaturally cheerful, echoed through the room. I stood frozen, phone in hand, as his words hung in the air. "What are you talking about, Richard?" "Oh, I've decided it's time for a change. I've moved Emma's stuff into the house. There's no room for you anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma's fork dropped with a clatter, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Richard, what in the world are you saying?" My voice was barely above a whisper, heart pounding in my chest. "It's simple, really. Emma doesn't want to come home because of you. Without you, she can finally live the life she deserves, like when she was a child. So leave." Emma stood up abruptly, anger flashing in her eyes. "Dad, what are you—" "Stay out of this, Emma." Richard's voice cut through, sharp and cold. "This is between me and your mother." My cheeks burned with a mix of humiliation and anger. "You want me to leave our home? Just like that?" "Yes, and you can go to some shelter or whatever. Doesn't matter to me." The call ended abruptly, leaving a haunting silence. My mother reached out, her hand trembling. "Elaine, honey." But before she could finish, Emma burst into laughter, incredulous and bitter. "He's lost it, Grandma. Completely lost it." Inside, I was a whirlwind of emotions. Humiliation, anger, and a strange sense of liberation. He better be ready, I thought to myself. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning. As I lay in my childhood bed that night, the moonlight casting shadows across the room, my mind wandered back through the years, sifting through memories of Richard and me. Our story wasn't always filled with cold silences and bitter words. There was a time when Richard's gaze held warmth, and his touch promised safety. I met Richard when I was in my late 20s. He was charming, confident, and seemed to have an answer for everything. I was captivated by his charisma and how he seemed to take the world in his stride. We married within a year of meeting, a whirlwind romance that felt like a fairy tale. But the fairy tale began to crumble soon after Emma was born. Richard's affection for our daughter was undeniable, yet as his love for her grew, his regard for me seemed to wane. It was as if his heart had room only for one. "Elaine, can't you see you're smothering her?" "Let her breathe," he would chide whenever I tried to be involved in Emma's upbringing. His words stung, but I believed he was just being an overly protective father. As Emma grew, so did Richard's disdain towards me. The man who once looked at me like I was his world now barely acknowledged my existence, except to criticize. "Why can't you be more like Emma? She's only 10 and already so independent," he'd say with a sneer. I remember the night when Emma, at 15, won a school award. We were supposed to celebrate as a family, but Richard turned it into a lecture session. "Elaine, why can't you achieve anything like our daughter? You're just wasting your life away," he said, his words like daggers. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of years of his contempt. It wasn't just the words, it was the dismissive glances, the heavy sighs, the way he'd turn away when I entered a room. I had become a ghost in my own home, invisible and insignificant. But that night, as I lay in the quiet, a resolve began to stir within me. Richard's callousness on the phone, his brazen dismissal of our life together, it had lit a fire in me. I wasn't going to let him erase me from my own story. I turned on my side, closing my eyes, but sleep eluded me. The shadows on the wall seemed to whisper, urging me to stand up, to fight back. And I knew, deep down, that I was ready to do just that. The next morning, I awoke with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. Over breakfast, Mom tried to discuss Richard's call, but I steered the conversation elsewhere. I wasn't ready to delve into that can of worms, not yet. Emma, sensing my unease, didn't press either. As we cleaned up, my thoughts drifted back to the recent years with Richard. His controlling behavior wasn't just confined to our daughter. It seeped into every aspect of our lives, tightening like a vice around my freedom. "Elaine, I don't want you working late. You need to be home to cook dinner," he would demand, disregarding my career in the library, which I cherished. His rules were arbitrary and ever-changing, designed to keep me off balance. If I wore something he didn't approve of, he would scoff. "Dressing up? Trying to impress someone? You should focus on being a better wife and mother." Even my friendships weren't spared. "You're spending too much time with Linda. She's a bad influence," he declared one day, his words slicing through years of friendship like a knife. But it wasn't just the control. It was the humiliation. At social gatherings, he would belittle me with backhanded compliments, often in front of Emma. "Elaine tries her best, but she's not the brightest bulb," he'd say with a laugh that made my skin crawl. Emma saw it all. At first, she tried to defend me, but Richard's influence was too strong. "Mom, just ignore him," she would whisper, a look of helplessness in her eyes. I remember the day Emma left for college. Richard was beaming with pride, but there was a coldness in his eyes when he turned to me. "See, Elaine, this is what happens when you raise a child right. She's not like you, thank God." That stung more than anything. The implication that I had no part in our daughter's upbringing, that my years of love and sacrifice meant nothing. As these memories churned in my mind, a simmering anger began to bubble to the surface. No more. I wouldn't let Richard dictate my life, not anymore. The phone call was the last straw. It was time for Richard to face the consequences of his actions. I looked at Emma, her face a mirror of my resolve. "Emma, there's something I need to do when we get back. It's going to change everything, but I need you to trust me." Emma nodded, determination in her eyes. "I'm with you, Mom, all the way." The drive back home was filled with a tense silence. Emma and I were both lost in our thoughts as the weight of the impending confrontation with Richard hanging heavy in the air. Once home, I retreated to my room, ostensibly to unpack, but really to make a call that would set everything in motion. I dialed the number of a divorce attorney I had discreetly noted down a few months ago. My hands trembled as I heard the line connect. "Hello, this is Elaine Richardson. I need to discuss a divorce." The lawyer, Mr. Adams, was calm and reassuring. "I understand this is a difficult time, Mrs. Richardson. We can help you navigate through this process." As I detailed Richard's behavior over the years, Mr. Adams listened intently. "We can file for divorce on grounds of emotional abuse. It seems you have a strong case." Feeling a sense of empowerment, I replied, "I want to go through with this, and I want him to pay for what he's done, not just legally, but financially, too." Mr. Adams assured me, "We will do everything we can to ensure you receive what you're entitled to." After the call, I felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. For the first time in years, I was taking control of my life. Later that evening, Richard returned home, his demeanor smug and triumphant. "So, you're back. Realized you have nowhere else to go?" His words cut deep, but I held my ground. "I went to my parents' house, Richard. Remember the place you practically banished me to?" He scoffed. "I did us a favor. Emma and I are better off without you." "That's where you're wrong," I said, my voice steady. "Emma is not a pawn in your twisted game, and I am not your prisoner anymore." Richard's face contorted in anger. "What are you blabbering about? You think you can survive without me?" I met his gaze, my resolve unwavering. "Watch me." Emma entered the room, her expression one of quiet strength. "Dad, you've gone too far. Mom doesn't deserve this." Richard sneered. "Oh, now you're taking her side? I thought you understood, Emma. Your mother is useless." Emma's eyes blazed with anger. "No, Dad. The only useless thing here is your cruelty. We're done living under your shadow." As we stood there, united against Richard's scorn, I knew we had crossed a point of no return. The battle lines were drawn, and I was ready to fight for my freedom. The morning after our declaration, the house felt like a battlefield. Richard's usual air of arrogance was more pronounced, as if he was daring us to challenge him. As I made breakfast, my hands shook slightly, but my resolve was firm. At the table, Richard broke the silence with his typical condescension. "So, Elaine, have you finally realized your place? Ready to beg for forgiveness?" I kept my voice calm. "There's nothing to beg for, Richard. I'm not the one who should be apologizing." He laughed, a cold, harsh sound. "You've always been delusional, but this is a new low, even for you." Emma, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Dad, this isn't a joke. We're serious. Mom is filing for divorce." The look on Richard's face was one I had never seen before. Confusion, disbelief, and then anger. "Divorce? You think you can just walk away from me after everything I've done for this family?" "It's precisely because of what you've done," I said, my voice rising. "Years of belittling, controlling, and humiliating me. I won't stand for it anymore." Richard slammed his fist on the table, his face red. "I made this family. Without me, you're nothing." Emma stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You didn't make this family, Dad. You tore it apart. And Mom is more than something. She's everything you're not." His gaze shifted between us, a wild look in his eyes. "You're teaming up against me, your own husband, your own father?" "This isn't about sides, Richard. It's about right and wrong," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "And what you've done is unforgivably wrong." Richard's laughter was bitter. "You think you can just leave and everything will be fine? You have no idea what you're in for." I met his gaze squarely. "I know exactly what I'm in for. Freedom from you." Emma moved to stand beside me, a united front. "We're done being under your control, Dad. It's over." Richard stood abruptly, his chair toppling behind him. "You'll regret this, both of you. You don't know what I'm capable of." As he stormed out of the room, the tension he left behind was suffocating. But amidst that tension, there was also a sense of liberation. The battle had begun, and I was ready to fight for my freedom, my dignity, and my daughter's future. The days following our confrontation with Richard were a whirlwind of activity. I met with Mr. Adams several times, laying out the groundwork for the divorce. He was meticulous, ensuring every detail was accounted for. "We'll make sure you get what you deserve, Elaine, both financially and legally," he assured me. Richard's reaction to the divorce papers was volcanic. He stormed into the house one evening, papers in hand, his face a mask of fury. "You're actually going through with this? Do you have any idea what you're doing, Elaine?" I faced him with a calm I didn't feel. "Yes, Richard, I do. For the first time in years, I'm making a decision for myself." He laughed mockingly. "You think you can survive without me? You're nothing without my money, my support." "I'm not afraid of being on my own, Richard. I'm more afraid of spending another day under the same roof as you," I replied, my voice steady. Emma, hearing the commotion, came downstairs. "What's going on?" "Your mother has lost her mind. That's what's going on," Richard spat out. "She thinks she can just take half of everything I've worked for. It's not just what you've worked for, Dad. It's what Mom has endured for all these years. She deserves every penny and more." Emma countered. Richard's eyes narrowed. "Don't be foolish, Emma. This will ruin us all." "No, Dad. It will free us, especially Mom." As the days turned into weeks, the house became a cold war zone. Richard moved into the guest room, his presence like a dark cloud. Despite his attempts to sway me, my decision was final. The day of the first court hearing arrived. As I sat in the courtroom, waiting for the proceedings to start, I felt an odd sense of serenity. I was doing the right thing, not just for myself, but for Emma as well. Richard, on the other hand, was a bundle of nerves. When his lawyer talked about a settlement, I couldn't help but smile. Richard, who always prided himself on his control, was now at the mercy of the court. As the judge reviewed our case, Richard's face grew paler. When the judge turned to me and asked if I had anything to add, I took a deep breath. "Your Honor, for years I endured emotional abuse and manipulation at the hands of my husband. I'm not seeking revenge, I'm seeking justice, for myself and for my daughter." The judge nodded, his expression solemn. "I understand, Mrs. Richardson. This court will ensure fair judgment is passed." As we left the courtroom, Richard's defeated look was all I needed to see. The battle wasn't over, but I had won the first round, and I was ready for whatever came next. In the weeks that followed, my life felt like it was under a microscope, scrutinized by lawyers in the court. But with each passing day, I felt stronger, more in control of my destiny. Richard's attempts to intimidate me became more desperate and less effective. The final court hearing was a day I had both dreaded and longed for. As Richard and I sat on opposite sides of the courtroom, I couldn't help but reflect on the man I once loved, now a stranger filled with bitterness. The judge's voice was firm as he delivered the verdict. "The court finds in favor of Mrs. Richardson. Mr. Richardson, you are required to pay alimony and half of your assets." Richard's face was a picture of shock and rage. He stood up abruptly, his chair clattering to the floor. "This is ridiculous. She doesn't deserve a penny." "Mr. Richardson, control yourself," the judge admonished. "The court has made its decision." As we left the courtroom, Richard's parting words were venomous. "You'll regret this, Elaine. You think you've won, but you haven't seen the end of me." But I no longer feared him. His words, once so cutting, now seemed empty and powerless. In the months that followed, I found a small apartment close to Emma's place. I started a new job at a local library, a place that had always brought me peace. The alimony from Richard allowed me financial freedom I hadn't experienced in years. Emma and I grew closer, our relationship no longer overshadowed by Richard's presence. She was thriving in her career and personal life, a stark contrast to the frightened young woman she had been. As for Richard, the last I heard, he was living a diminished life, his pride and finances greatly reduced. His attempts to reach out to Emma and me were met with silence. The man who once held so much power over us was now just a memory, a shadow of the past. I often sit on my balcony, a cup of tea in hand, looking out at the peaceful neighborhood. I've found a sense of tranquility and purpose that was missing for so long. The journey was painful, filled with struggles and heartaches, but it led me to a place of peace. Emma visits often, and we talk about everything and nothing. Our bond, forged in adversity, is now unbreakable. As I look towards the future, I do so with hope and a sense of freedom. I've emerged from the shadows of my past stronger and more resilient. I've learned that sometimes the hardest battles lead to the greatest triumphs. And as for Richard, he is nothing more than a distant echo, a reminder of a life I once lived and the strength I gained in leaving it behind.